Ena mana, ena iwi, ena reo, tena koutou katoa. I also speak English. That's a Maori greeting. Ena mana, I respect the very important work that all of you are doing in your various fields, your mana. Ena reo, I respect the fact that I hope you can understand my English. I'll promise to understand your English, having lived here for a couple of years, several years ago. And Ena reo is the language. You respect your language. And Ena iwi is a respect for where you come from, your tribe, Maori word for tribe. So I mean all of those. And tena koutou katoa means welcome, welcome to you all. This is a return to my roots, nearly my roots. My real roots are back home in New Zealand, but a return to my roots where I did my PhD under my esteemed colleague and friend, Peter Mittler, a few years ago, Peter. Yeah, we won't talk about those dates. And my wife, Jill, also did some study here when we were here with our family at that time. So I do acknowledge my indebtedness to this institution, and in particular to the people I've worked with, like Alan and Susie and Peter. I think that's all. Perhaps, no, I don't think I've missed anyone. So I'm talking about diversities tonight. And it's, I think, true to say that diversities enthrall us, attract us, but at the same time some repel us and we want to eliminate them. It's an area that's constantly in the news, how people are different psychologically, different in their attitudes towards the world, different in their world views. And that's been the challenge that I've taken on over the last 2 years in looking at this particular book. And in the presentation and in my book that I'll be basing the presentation on, I've established 2 goals. What am I trying to achieve in looking at children who come from diverse backgrounds? And in establishing those 2 goals, and I'll come to them later, I've looked at 19, sounds a lot, and it is a lot, 19 different perspectives and principles, and I'm going to share some of them with you today, because I think when we're looking at diversity, we've got to have various frameworks, and I hope to outline some of those frameworks with you tonight. When I came to the end of writing my book, which has just been sent off to my publisher, I wrote a conclusion. And this is what I said in my conclusion. It is an indictment on politicians and educators that underachievement and discrimination among diverse learners has been tolerated for so long. It need not be the case, I believe. We know enough about the causes of disadvantage and underachievement and about the remedies, yet we continue not to take effective action. And I believe that such dereliction of our duties, and I include us advisedly in that statement, our dereliction of our duties towards the most vulnerable of our children must cease. And as the title of my talk today indicates, I think it must cease pretty quickly. Now that's a pretty hard-hitting, deliberately, but I hope accurate summation of the standing that we have at the moment in terms of the way children who come from diverse backgrounds are not succeeding many, are not succeeding in our school system and in our societies. I think things have to change. And as I indicate here, I believe we have enough evidence as to what needs to change and how it needs to be changed. But I think we've got a major obligation. I do not think we can continue. When I say we, I'm thinking worldwide. I do not think we can continue to have a system of education in which there is so much failure. Would we tolerate that in medicine? Would we tolerate the success rates, or the failure rates, I should say, that we have in education around the world in our medical services? We wouldn't. Would we tolerate the kind of failures that we have in our education systems if it were to apply to things like engineering? If buildings consistently collapsed, if aeroplanes consistently fell out of the sky, would we tolerate that? I believe not. Now, there are parallels between other professions and education, which we should take account of. I think at the beginning, I must place myself in a context, and I have some little geography lesson for you and a little bit of tourism. For those of you who are a little bit geographically challenged, here we are down in the southwest Pacific, hard up against Australia it looks, but we're 2,500 kilometres away, quite a distance. And we look kind of small down there, but have a look up at the British Isles. We're exactly the same area geographically as the British Isles, so we're not too minute in the world scale of things. We come from Christchurch down here. Some of you might have heard of events, sad events that took place, like 2011, wasn't it? A major earthquake in Christchurch killed 185 people. Okay, so a little bit about visiting New Zealand. This is our capital, Wellington. I put that in just to show you that we do have cities as well as some other events. The place of New Zealand is, it resonates with me, and I think with Jill, the outdoors, the space, the mountains, the rivers, the coastlines, and so on. So a few pictures just to show you what our country looks like. This is called Mitre Peak in the Milford Sound area, down in the South Island. These are called the Punakaiki rocks. They're sort of layered like pancakes. That's what we call them, pancake rocks. Here we are, Mount Cook. That's my mountain. The Maori people always say they have a mountain and a river. This is my mountain. I went to school within sight of Mount Cook, Aorangi, which is about 12,300 feet high, so quite a big one, I think. I want to use this image because I'm talking about a path. What is the path? Or are there multiple paths to improving the lot of children who are disadvantaged for one reason or another? I'll come back to that image a little later on. I like this quote, this picture from Banksy. We are all humans until race disconnected us, religion separated us, politics divided us, and wealth classified us. Powerful words. So what is the situation that I'm trying to rectify, as it were? When I look at super diversity, there are many different ways in which we can talk about diversity. I won't go through each of them. You can see there's a whole range here. My book and the focus tonight is on the big five of diversity. So I'll be talking or referring to sex and gender. That's my book. I only occasionally make reference. Social class or socioeconomic status, that'll be the main focus, but not the exclusive one. I'll be talking about race and ethnicity and culture. Sorry, the typing didn't come out that well. I'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about beliefs and religion, and I'll be talking about ability or disability as a cluster. And I won't be talking about the others, but they're important too. Just taking age. I am critical of our school systems which tend to focus on age, subdividing knowledge, subdividing children into groups according to age. I think that is becoming outdated as technology and other developments take place. But that won't be a focus tonight. So super diversity, let's take a few examples of this. By the way, this term super diversity may be new to you. It's fairly new to me. It comes from Stephen Vertovec, who was, I think maybe, I'm not sure, at Oxford University. Somebody said he might be Birmingham, but that's his term. He talks about it in terms of immigrants, but I'm referring to it more generally. So, as you are well aware of, it's been in the news time and time again. Europe, and I include the UK in that category, at least temporarily. Not sure what's going to happen in June. As you know, there have been at least 1 million migrants and refugees coming into Europe in 2015. It looks as though that rate of migration is going to continue. That's one example. Another example is in your own country, where minorities, ethnic minorities, have increased in that last 10-year period from 2003 from 16% to 26%, a very rapid increase in your ethnic diversity. New Zealand, the European background, people with European backgrounds like myself, incidentally, and both Jill and myself have an English and Scottish and German background going back. I think we're both fourth generation New Zealanders. That's our particular background. We're part of that migrant community. By the way, we're part of the neo-colonial heritage that we've inherited in New Zealand and trying to rectify. So as you can see, people like myself and Jill, we're going to become less and less a proportion in the population. Then if we look at religious diversity, just to give you some statistics here, between 2001 and 11, those who identified as Christians decreased from 72% to 59%, and a corresponding increase in those who have no religions. If I give you another example or two, Singapore is the most religiously diverse country in the world, with 34% Buddhist, 18% Christian, 16% with no affiliation, 14% Muslim, and so on. Very diverse culturally. In New Zealand, those who identified as Christians, in 1966 we had 89% of the census returns, 89% said they were background of Christianity. 2006, 89 went down to 54%. So many Western countries, I've given you some examples, are becoming less Christian and more atheistic or more inclined to say they have no religion, not necessarily abiding by atheism. So the big five are what I've focused on in my book. I think the significant thing about this diagram is to look at the interconnections that exist between the various categories of diversity. I believe that it's important not to just take one of those categories alone and focus on them. We have to look at how they interact with each other. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more. I want to focus on a bit more of the problem. Let's look at the relationship between socioeconomic status and achievement. Robert Putnam, he talks about the most important divide in America is class, not race. And the place where it matters most is in the home. David Berliner? Berliner. He has a very similar perspective on what is most important. The UK research here, and I think Alan and many others would be very familiar with it, shows that social class is the strongest predictor of educational achievement. Must be taken extremely seriously. OECD data, taking the OECD group of industrialized countries, say the rich countries, students from low socioeconomic status, twice as likely to be low performers. Now, this has been known for some time, and it's continuing, and it's not improving. I think it's an extraordinarily serious matter. But if we look at, But as I mentioned, I just focused on socioeconomic status there. But I do want to emphasize that, as I showed in my diagram earlier, diversities interact particularly with ethnicity and gender and class. Steve Strand, he's from Oxford University, I think still, he talks about a particular combination of class, gender and ethnicity. And it's that particular combination which seems to be uniquely related to attainment. You'd be perhaps familiar with his research. Just to give you an example, when he looked at low socioeconomic status boys, he found that white British and black Caribbean boys were the lowest scoring groups. I think, and he had other statistics too, I won't go into, which show the importance of considering intersectionality. I love that word, it's sort of got a rhythm to it, intersectionality, which suggests that when we look at data from schools, we should be looking at disaggregating data so that we've got information on the performance of various groupings and subgroupings. I think that should take place at the school and certainly at the system level. Okay. Now, I've already hinted at the problems. Let's take a little bit more. OECD countries, those who are more advantaged socioeconomically across the, how many, I think 20 odd countries in the OECD, 26, I think, about that. They scored 39 points higher than those who were less advantaged, taking the PISA mathematics tests. You know the PISA examinations, I'm sure. 15-year-olds carried out every 3 years on a sample of 15-year-olds in the OECD countries, plus a number of partner countries who aren't members of OECD. So it incorporates a lot of countries. And that gap among, this is, remember, 15-year-olds, it's the equivalent of nearly 1 year of schooling. So by the time they get to 15, children from low socioeconomic status have lost a a year compared with those of high socioeconomic status. John Hattie, my compatriot, although he's now deserted us to go to Australia, in Melbourne, okay. But I'm sure you're familiar with John Hattie's work, aren't you? Visible learning. And he describes effect sizes when he compares multiple sources of data and combines them. And when you look at the relationship between socioeconomic status and achievement, it comes down to 0.57, which he describes as a very notable influence to be taken seriously. Then we look at, that was achievement. I've already, I think, driven home the close relationship between socioeconomic status and achievement, which is worrying in its own right. But then we look at behavioural data, children who are referred or included in special education because of behavioural reasons. In my own country, Maori students, the indigenous population, overrepresented in special education programs for those with behavioural issues. Disproportionality comes through here. Incidentally, if we look at other categories, disability excluding those with behavioural problems, there are no differences between Maori and non-Maori in terms of special education enrolments. Those with intellectual disability or physical disability, no significant difference. Comes through in the behavioural issue area. If we look at your country, if we look at groups like the Black Caribbean group, the mixed white and black Caribbean pupils, 1.5 times more likely to be identified as having behavioural or emotional and social difficulties than white British pupils. So, and one more, students of colour in America are disproportionately placed in special education overall, and certainly are most often referred for discipline reasons. Now, that's one area which I hope demonstrates why we should be worried. We should not maintain those disadvantages, especially when we, I think, have within our knowledge base and our capacity to rectify many of them. And that's what I'm going to go on and demonstrate and insist on now. But when we're looking at this issue, I mentioned something like 19 different perspectives, and here's one. Disruptive technologies. They impact disproportionately on disadvantaged students, I believe. What do I mean by disruptive technologies? Well, this is the guy who invented the term, I think, Christensen. He said that these are new emerging technologies that unexpectedly displace established ones. The McKinsey Global Institute have done a major study on disruptive technologies around the Western countries. And they said that there are something like 12 different technologies that will, or that are and will continue, or perhaps even increase in their impact on societies, economies, and lives. They are, for example, the mobile internet, the automation of knowledge work. More and more knowledge occupations are being eroded by computers. The Internet of Things, advanced robotics, these are all those technologies that McKinsey have identified. The cloud, the autonomous vehicle, next generation storage, 3D printing, the list goes on. These are going to change and are changing the nature of work that is going to be available. And think of those who are going to have fewer and fewer opportunities for employment now and in the future as these advanced technologies gain impetus and change the nature of work. Frey and Osborne, I think they're also from Oxford, do you know? I think they are from memory. They take up that point and say that when we look at the next 20 years, that 47% of jobs are at risk for automatization in the next 20 years. So we're facing a situation where those who are disadvantaged because they leave school with few or no qualifications because of various factors related to their backgrounds are going to have no skills that will be able to be employed in this new environment, technological environment. That in itself is an extraordinarily big worry. And if we look at the social problems that will emerge as a result of that, I think we've got a serious, serious problem with more and more people who are unemployed and, in this new world, unemployable. Of course, then we've got to look at technology as a positive, which I believe it is. And ICT, into communications and technology, it's increasingly influencing what, where and how we teach. So there are changes that are taking place rapidly in every country, I think every Western country at least, in adapting to technology. Just to give you an example, where we live in a small town north of Christchurch, a new school being developed, brand new school. It is designed to be flexible. It is flexible in its architecture. Instead of separate boxes called classrooms, there's open space where you can assemble groups of 3 different classes in one area. It is designed to be flexible in terms of the seating, the furniture. It is so kids can sit on the floor, in beanbags, at desks, in armchairs. It is designed, and this is where I'm coming to the point here, it is designed to be flexible in terms of the individualization of the programs, using the internet, sending kids off to do research on projects on the internet. It is designed to be flexible in the way we group children. A large class sometime, small group, individualized work and so on. So we're seeing changes that are taking place in the what, where and how we teach. But even when we come to that, and the utilization of computers and access to the internet in our schools, we have the digital divide. And guess what? Who falls below that divide? Those who are poor, or those whose families do not have an understanding of the importance of accessing the world of knowledge through the internet, for example, and don't have a computer through choice, not just through necessity. Okay. Now, this intrigues me. Not catering for diversity has an economic cost. And why is it that we don't believe that? Why is it that we say it is not worth, economically, just taking that point alone, why is it that economically we don't recognise the importance of building up achievement? Now, back to McKinsey. They say that there's a very strong economic arguments for lowering the gap between low and high income people. And they have done some economic analysis to show that the GDP, if we could reduce or eliminate that gap between high and low socioeconomic status, the GDP would go up to 3 to 5%. Now that's pretty good, you know. It's a damned good economic investment to narrow that gap. Of course, that's not the only reason. But we'll come back to those a little later. Wilkinson and Pickett, you've heard the work, I'm sure, the spirit level, and they've argued that the bigger the income gap in a country, the more social problems you have in those countries. So it impacts, that gap impacts on society as a whole. Not just those who are disadvantaged, but it flows over to everybody else. I think they've just got a film out, haven't they? I read somewhere that there's a film based on their work. I'm not sure, I haven't got the background, I just saw a fleeting reference to it a little while ago. Okay, you know Thomas Piketty, the French economist, and his now very well-known work on capital in the 21st century. And very briefly, as I understand his argument, he's saying that there is a big divergence between returns on capital, that is investments, and those who have the money and can invest it, and what they get as a return. And then if we compare their rate of return on their capital, the money that they've made, the profits that they've made, the high salaries that they've made, and we compare that with the returns on labour, that gap is increasing. Do you see what I mean? I think he's got a very powerful argument here. He, in 800 odd pages, I think, if I try and summarise a couple of main points, he's saying that that gap is very, very serious. He talks about the top in America, just taking America, not just America, but let's take it, the top 10% of Americans in terms of income. They own about 70% of the capital in that country. Half of that belongs to the top 1%. Now you've heard the arguments of criticising the 1% and so on. And we've seen the beginnings of rebellion against that discrepancy. He's saying, how do we arrest that gap, that growing discrepancy, that growing, you know, the Gini index, which gives an indication between the top salaries and the lowest salaries? How can we stop that Gini index in many countries getting bigger? Not in the UK, apparently, I've read recently. It is in New Zealand, that Gini index, showing a growing disparity of incomes between high and low incomes. He's saying that there should be a progressive annual tax on wealth. That's in a very brief nutshell. Okay, let's move on. Now, this, I want to say, is something that we've got to worry about. When we look, Hartshorne is a geographer, when we look at a society at any one point of time, there are competing forces. Some forces run the risk, or some forces threaten to upset, even destroy society. Other forces hold societies together. And he talks about the distinction between centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. Now, I'm worried that there are many centrifugal forces, and I've hinted at some of these centrifugal forces, which I think are now and will be a threat to the integrity of many Western countries, unless they are arrested. How long can we tolerate what I've just indicated before? How long will those who are victims of systems that fail them, that exclude them, before those forces become centrifugal? How long? Whereas we may be reaching the tipping point, I feel, and we've seen examples of that tipping point in Paris, Baltimore, Brussels. And I think when we look around, we see examples of that tipping point perhaps approaching more seriously. If we look back in our histories, you know, we had the French Revolution when the aristocracy, and that discrepancy between the aristocracy and the peasantry became intolerable to the peasantry, to the workers. The same thing in Russia, when the discrepancy between the aristocracy and the peasantry and the workers became intolerable. We've seen that. So we've got to think, what are the centripetal forces? They used to be religion. That was the glue that held societies together. And in some countries we may think perhaps that is already one of the glues. But in Western countries, as I've indicated earlier with the statistics on the decline of adherence to Christianity and the rise of non-religious, religion is no longer a glue. It's not working. We have some societies, and we've seen several in the Middle East, that were held together by dictatorships. They suppressed any of those centrifugal forces. Certainly don't want that. I believe that the only centripetal force is education. That's where our hope is, and that's the theme that I'm addressing here today. So, I believe that the equilibrium we have at the moment is tipping more towards centrifugal than centripetal forces. Now, what are some of the causes of these problems associated with diversity? There are multiple causes. And we haven't got time to go into them, but I've explored them in my book. We've got to consider evolution. Evolution means that diversity occurs. And in many cases, that's a darn good thing, because we adapt to new environments over eons of our history as a species. We've got globalization. That's changing a lot of the way in which diversity is going to be considered. You know, globalization is going to contribute to the loss of some of these jobs, outsourcing of jobs, plus the disruptive technologies. We've got poverty, we've got genetics, we've got environmental degradation, we've got the threats of climate change. We've got multiple sources of diversity, which is creating, in some cases, major problems. And unfortunately, we must also implicate education. These are sweeping generalizations, and I apologize for making them, but trying for the brevity sake of brevity, to accomplishment. Our education, I think, the way in which we organise our education, we have examples of poor pedagogy. We have examples of inappropriate curriculum. And I've hinted at the necessity for a curriculum that must take account of modern developments in technology. We have inappropriate assessment, and I know assessment is a huge issue here with the constricting emphasis that assessment has on what can happen in your education system with your league tables and so on. We have teachers who unfortunately are not well trained or not held sufficiently accountable. So within our education system, I think we've got to get our house in order. And that's what I'm trying to drive at. Okay. Now, when we're looking at diversity, I think we've also got to take account of these scholars, Bourdieu and Gramsci and Freire. Very, very briefly, they talk about, or at least Bourdieu talks about cultural capital. Capital, the kind of capital, the kind of what students bring to the learning situation, their habits, their skills, their dispositions, the way they see the world, their attitudes. And I don't know whether we fully understand as teachers, and I don't know when I was a teacher, I fully understood children who came from backgrounds different to my own, with a value that I placed on reason, intellect, and that sort of thing. I don't know whether our teachers fully have that capacity to understand kids who come with different cultural capital, who come with working class values. So I feel there may be a disconnect between the school as an organisation and an environment and the people who have the power in that school and the way they see the world and the way the children and the parents with some backgrounds see the world. That's a big challenge, I think. It requires teachers to engage in reflective practice, to see, to ask themselves, how do I really see these children? What judgments do I make? Am I blaming these children for things which are, as it were, outside their control? I don't know. So then we have a look at Gramsci's work, and you'd be familiar with his work talking about the hegemony of the dominant class being reproduced in our schools. And then we've got Paulo Freire, who talks about the balance of power between the colonizer, or the oppressor, and the colonised, the oppressed. That comes home in New Zealand. As I mentioned earlier, many Maori scholars say that in New Zealand, we've inherited the neo-colonial history. My great-grandfather, only 3 or 4 generations back, he came to New Zealand. He helped in the colonisation of it. He fought the Maori. He was a member of the British Navy. Okay, moving on. That's one of the perspectives. Some caveats when we're looking. I don't want to say that when you've got a group of people that, say, have the label low socioeconomic status, or when you have a group of people called Maori or Black Caribbean and so on, I don't want to imply or even suggest that they are homogeneous. We have diversity within diversity, which I think we must take account of. There is much overlap. If we take let's see, ethnicity, yeah, overlaps. If we take gender, overlaps. Moving on. A related point is that when we look at statistics, I was very interested in writing the chapter on gender differences. I saw that there were many differences between the genders, at least male and female, not looking at LGBT and so on, in terms of a whole lot of variables like attainment, like maths skills, like verbal skills and so on. Some in favour of boys, some in favour of girls. But when we look at it, some of those differences, although they're statistically significant, they really are quite small. Just to give you an example, I've got one up here. If we get a D equals 0.20, which is a pretty good statistically significant finding, what does that actually mean in reality? It means this, that 54% of one gender exceeds the 50th percentile of the other. Now that's a pretty small difference, isn't it? But it's still statistically significant. In other words, there's a huge overlap between the two genders in terms of achievement in that area. So the message I come back to, don't exaggerate these differences. Remember, overlaps are there to be looked at. Now, the next point, I'd like to tell you a story about a boy who was brought up in an isolated part of the country. His parents left school when he was 13. There were very few books in the home. His father was the sort of person who believed and it said that children should be seen but not heard. You know that phrase? That boy went on to succeed at school, to become a professor, and he's standing here. I was that boy. In fact, I still am. Somewhere in there is a boy who experienced being a low socioeconomic status boy. The point I want to make here is that some kids, despite the backgrounds that they might have, are resilient. I mean, we don't just look at children as being clay that's shaped by the environment. We look at children as being producing themselves, as having they process the world themselves. They make sense of the world. They have a degree of intellectual autonomy. So we've got to remember that, I think. Let's have a look now. Some individuals are resilient, I believe. Let's take some figures from Hong Kong, China, Shanghai, Singapore and Vietnam. Here are some figures. 13% of kids from low socioeconomic status homes, 13%, okay, perform among the top 25%. So you would normally predict that children in that low socioeconomic status group, they wouldn't do well. But 13%, small but significant, 13% of these children go on and perform at the top 25%. But academic success is not always accompanied by improved health outcomes, as you might expect or hope for. For example, a United States study, I think it was a fairly recent one, found that academic success among resilient black children, African American children, it was accompanied by poorer health outcomes. Not quite sure of the reasoning that went into that, but that was the finding. And also, there is good research to show that Chinese students in many countries outside China, in New Zealand and America, and I think in the UK as well, from what I've read, they do very well academically. But this can generate, according to some research I've read, anxiety to continue to perform well. So resilience is there, but we've got to be careful that that is managed. And a related point is that some schools, and I believe I went to schools like this, beat the odds. Some schools, despite the profile of their communities, do very well. I was very fortunate, I think, to be in schools where I had well-qualified and I think competent teachers. And they were working in communities a bit like my mother's community of working class, low socioeconomic status families. So that was good. Some solutions, moving quickly, I'll take just quickly through some of these. The first point I would like to make, I'm going to spend another 5 minutes on this and then stop. I gave an economic rationale for improving the performance of children who come from disadvantaged homes. I believe that that is only part of the argument. Another driver, irrespective of whether there is an economic gain, is the need to respect the human rights of diverse peoples. As expressed in way back in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all the associated declarations, conventions that have occurred since then, the most recent one being, Peter's nodding, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Okay. I won't go through more of that. I haven't got time on that. I think we've also got to have a view on what theories of distributive justice should underpin our approach to diversity. Strict egalitarianism, I don't think works. It's impossible that everybody should get exactly the same. That's not what I'm arguing for. Libertarianism is unfortunately rampant in your country, my country, and many others, but is perhaps being challenged. So then we've got utilitarianism, the greater good being argued. I've looked at Kant's rationally determined moral principles, believe that that's a very sound basis for proceeding. But particularly, I look at Rawls's theories of distributive justice. And he talks about the difference principle. And he's saying that it is desirable, justifiable to discriminate against, to discriminate for people, provided that you are going to improve the performance, improve the lot of the most disadvantaged. So positive discrimination is legitimate. So his divergence from strict equality is permitted so long as the inequalities would make the least advantaged in society materially better off. So that's the point I'm adhering to. Okay. When I'm looking at the way in which we can frame education, I've taken what Alan and his colleagues have also taken, a slightly different way of expressing it, a notion of an ecological notion. You're familiar with Yuri Bronfenbrenner's work, I'm sure. I don't like the concentric circles, I like the spiral to show the interconnection. And another point I like between in the model here is the fact that the flow can be both ways. So you get bidirectionality. So children influence the family, family influences the child, and so on right through the model. So fluidity is important. And to give you some examples, when I look at socioeconomic status, here are, going back to that model, here are some of the societal level accommodations that we need to look at. I don't believe that we can legitimately focus exclusively on education. We must look at the context. We must look at what happens in the community and society. And for example, these are some of the societal ways of rectifying low socioeconomic performance. We're into politics, we're into economics here, but these are extremely important areas to look at. I believe that we must take a multi-pronged approach to working with people with disadvantages, and this includes societal level accommodations. We can also look at the system level, coming down into the way in which our education system is organised, and an example of this would be what I'm advocating in the book, and that Alan has done, and Kirsten has done some fine work, internationally respected work, on the notion of the full service school, where education is not siloized, is that a word? Not placed into silos, but it is associated with other social agencies. So changing the nature of the school into being a multi-purpose social facility, working with all aspects of the human being and their needs. And that's a dramatic shift in the way in which we frame the purpose and ultimately the organisation of our schools. And then if we go to the school level, remember that model, I'm coming now down to the school. One of the very important ways of acting at the school level is to forbid streaming. Streaming only works for high achievers. Streaming, putting kids into ability levels. Okay. It has a negative effect on children with low socioeconomic backgrounds and low achievement. And the same applies to within-class ability grouping. Okay. And then when we're looking at the classroom level, what a teacher can do day to day, I mentioned understanding the worldviews of kids, high but realistic expectations. I'm going to stop, I think, after this one and quickly go through the final one to get to a conclusion. I found this work of Derek Bell, who talks about interest convergence. And when we're talking about the need to change, it means that there are some with change means some with power will have to relinquish some of that power to enable those without power to gain some power. So when does that occur? Derek Bell, he talked about Brown versus the Board of Education, the desegregation Supreme Court case in 1954, which desegregated American schools. And he said, why? And it comes down to what he called interest convergence. It was at the time of the Cold War, he said. And America wanted to project an image of being aware of human rights, in this case of black Americans. And the way to do that, to demonstrate and to gain respect and perhaps hegemony, to gain respect was to give rights to black people in the school system. And I think we've seen another example with Angela Merkel. You know, why did she come out last year in favour of so many migrants being accepted into Germany? Why? Demographically. The argument behind her reasoning was not kindness or compassion, but demographically, low birth rates in Germany meant that the workforce is diminishing and there was a need for more migrants. Okay, so there was not an altruistic motive behind what she was saying. And I believe that if we're going to change some of our systems in the direction of improving the lot of disadvantaged people, we've got to look at interest convergence. I've argued that economics is a strong driver, but how far down the system would that penetrate? I've got more. I'm going to jump to the conclusion. I've argued very strongly for inclusive education. We separate unnecessarily and undesirably, we separate divergent children in our school systems. We separate, and I'm saying my country and I'm saying your country, and I think some of our colleagues from Asia, Taiwan and so on, you can look at that too. You know, just take gender. We separate children according to gender for educational purposes. Some countries more than other countries. We separate children by disability. Increasingly we're bringing them together, but we still have special, separate facilities, special schools or special classes. We separate by religion. We saw a school at the museum yesterday of Muslim children attending a Muslim school. We separate socioeconomic status by where they live. You know, we've got schools which are predominantly low socioeconomic status, simply because the school serves the local community. We separate children by ethnicity for similar reasons. So we have a highly segregated way of looking at our children. And I believe that that has to change. It has to change through teacher education. We come back to the statement I made at the beginning, which I'd remind you of. It is an indictment on politicians and educators, and I take some of the blame, that this has been tolerated for so long. As Wells said, human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. The centrifugal forces. But there's some good news, I won't go on to that. Okay. So, diversities. Celebrate them. Protect those who have problems associated with their different backgrounds, in our own interests economically, because they have the human rights to achieve without discrimination and to play a full part in an increasingly complex, globalized, technologically sophisticated world. That's it. Challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, David. A couple of things have struck me, and I'm just going to throw out some things that have struck me, and then we've got a little bit of time for you to talk about the things that struck you about that, and maybe if you just want to frame it as comments, or if you want to frame it as questions, That's fine either way. Three things struck me, David, and I'm not asking you to respond to these, but just to get people thinking. One thing that struck me was what happens when you take educational issues and you frame them in a global and an interdisciplinary context. Because I think all of us tend to look like that at the bit of education that we're interested in, and it's quite right because we've got serious work to do in that. But every now and again, just to take the blinkers off and look up and look at how what we're doing relates to a whole set of other social, economic, human rights, you name it, set of issues, seems to me to be very refreshing, and maybe you want to reflect on that. The second thing that struck me was a specific thing you said, where you said the only centripetal force is education. And that made me think two things. First thing was, is that right? Is that what we've got, and is there nothing else? And the second thing was, well, if it's right, or even if there's an element of truth in that, what are the implications for what education has to be like? Because the way education is currently framed in most, certainly affluent countries, is not as the one thing that holds society together. It's a very different thing. And I was interested that you got onto the idea of what schools might need to be like, and how they might not need to be like the way that traditionally they have been and that most schools continue to be. So that struck me as being an issue. And then, until you got onto the last bit, I was writing down, yes, but what about the practical politics of this? This is what things ought to look like, but how do we get from there to here in the political realities that we all face globally and in our different countries? And I like the idea of interest convergence, but I think there's probably more to say about what the practicalities of getting these kinds of things to happen might be. So they were my observations. Can I hand over to you? Other observations, comments, questions? And if you don't say anything, I shall pick on Gracie and make Gracie ask a question.
So hi, I'm Gracie. I'm a PhD student. So I was just wondering, is education human right? It's just one thing that strikes me, because the other day I'm listening to BBC radio on, is human rights global? Is it a global, how do we define it? And I'm thinking through the issue of human rights. So, because for some countries, for example, during the time I think of the definition of human rights by Confucianism, and it's mentioning that it's not the individual dignity, but it's more of a social society relationship and also the role they carry out as a human right. So is education a human right? Yeah, that's my question.
Sorry, Gracie, I wasn't actually meaning that you were going to ask the question, but given that you have done, that is a great question. Thank you.
The United Nations various declarations quite explicitly include reference to education being a human right. There's no doubt about that. Other aspects of the human rights conventions include that there should not be discrimination on the grounds of all those areas of diversity that I've mentioned, and others too. So it is not acceptable internationally to say that certain groups of children should not have access to education, nor is it acceptable that they should be in any way disadvantaged in the education system. A final point I'd make here is that the human rights background in 1948, it's an individual. We're talking about the rights of individuals, not group rights. And that's an important distinction to make. So we must recognise that it is individuals that are the focus. We're not necessarily looking at groups. Okay. Good question, though. Yeah.
Peter, I've got a very specific question. The issues you're raising are fantastically important. There is, I think, a growing awareness of the issues that you're raising, certainly in this country and throughout Europe. The trouble is very little is being done about it. So there has been a huge impact of the Wilkinson and Pickett work and a lot of other work that's gone on since then. And politicians talk about it, but very, very little happens. The specific question I have to you is something you just raised briefly. I want to ask you, what do you think we know about those children who beat prediction? Now, we first heard about those in the huge National Child Development Study of 17,000 children born in 1957. And they've been followed up, they've now become grandparents. But there was a follow-up to these children to look at those who were most disadvantaged and how they did. And as you found, they did much worse than others. But there was a significant minority of children in the most possible disadvantaged circumstances, and there were objective criteria for those at the time. There was a minority of children who beat prediction, who did well at school, got good jobs, who became contributing citizens, and a research team went to interview those children when they were in their 30s. And with an effort to answer the question I'm asking, what's the difference? Because we're talking about thousands of children now. And the only thing that came out of it with any certainty was the number of these young men and women who referred to the influence of their fathers. For once, fathers get invoked. It was my dad that did it. It was my dad that told me that education mattered, and that's how they attributed the fact that they escaped from disadvantage. That was the name of the book. That's not very much, but it's something to go on. There's an awful lot of children. And then our inspectorate got interested in this question. What is it about schools in very, very disadvantaged areas, defined in terms of postcodes, the most deprived small communities in this country? And they found that some schools in those areas were doing well. So HMI went to visit them to try and distill what it was about those schools that was different from other schools in the area. And what they came up with was the characteristics of an effective school that has been researched here in many other places. So that in a way was good news, but it didn't get us all that much further. Now, can you add to that? What more do we know about those children and young people who, despite appalling backgrounds of deprivation, poverty, everything on your slides, nevertheless, how the word is resilience. Now, resilience is a highly researched area now. It's not just a good word in the dictionary. There's a lot of research about resilience. Can you unpack that a little bit and say, what else do we know about those children? Because we knew that, we could perhaps build on it.
Well, I'm not sure that I can point to any research of the calibre that you've mentioned, but I would think that we've got to consider the considerable impact of the family, and you mentioned the father, but I would extend it to the family. Again, we shouldn't stereotype. Come back to that point of the fact that there is diversity within diversity, and although they meet certain criteria, low socioeconomic status in terms of income, in terms of level of education, and so on, there is still diversity. They're not a homogeneous group. So we must not go down the track of, stereotyping. So within that group of low socioeconomic status families, we would have many families, perhaps a small number, a small proportion, who value education, who are very verbal, who did not receive opportunities when they were kids, but nevertheless have many of the attributes that we normally associate with well-educated, well-off families. So that's one approach that I would take on that. The second approach is that although I've been critical of teachers and other fellow educators, we get good teachers. Some teachers are wishing to go to low socioeconomic status families. They've got a mission. They see themselves as having skills or interests or responsibilities in that area, and they will, of course, nurture those children. But the third thing we come back to is the diversity of human beings, and that we are not all the same. We basically, a human being, I think, makes sense of the world. They learn to control their place in the world. They process information, and that's on a continuum. And some kids, will make a success of this processing of the world around them and understanding their capacity. So we come back to the ecological model that I had. Sometimes it's within the child, the variation that we have just in human beings alone. Sometimes it's within the family, as I mentioned, and you've mentioned. Sometimes it's within the classroom environment. Yeah. So I think it's multiple. There are multiple reasons. It's probably worth unpacking even further. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. You mentioned both failure and attainment. And if we said that our understandings of failure and attainment are strongly linked to the current paradigm, which is one of reification, do we need to interrogate those notions of failure and attainment? What are we talking about when we're now talking about failure and attainment?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think we must broaden our concept of achievement to include much more than literacy and numeracy, important as they are. We've got to look at creativity, we've got to look at social skills, social interaction skills that, of working within groups of people and influencing peers and so on. So the notion of attainment should not be constricted, and hence we may have a profile of attainment, some of which may be considered by sort of rational or by other means, some means as being a failure. But then we've got others that may be other areas of functioning which may be very successful, and which may in fact be most important for the future. So I think coming back to there, that the message that I'd take from what I've just said is that our schools should not be seen as just factories for producing high marks and performance in a constricted area of human functioning. What do you think?
I think, well, I was reading an interesting account from somebody from a low socio-economic background, self-defined, and she was talking about her children and saying her children were very good at engaging with other species, at building things, at systems thinking, she was calling it. She used other terms, but they're very good at relating one thing to another and making and engaging in problem solving,
Right.
which is not necessarily assessed, but which is very important. But she was saying her children have persistently failed all the way through school, and that what they bring is simply not valued. And she was saying that it's, she wasn't necessarily relating it to being in a low socio-economic group, but she was saying my children are not respected. What they can bring to any given situation is not respected. So,
Yeah.
so that's kind of the genesis of this particular question.
Yes, yeah. Good.
I think we've got just time for one more question or comment.
Could I just say, Alan, that we've got some flyers for the book
Yeah.
that's coming up? Yeah.
So we'll leave those later. If there's no other question or comment, I'm just going to push you for 1 minute
Yep.
on this business of the practical politics. Because we've had people speaking here. I'm thinking of Pauline Lippman, who visited us not long since. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I will do. I think she'd say, interest convergence. No, there's no such thing as a convergence of interest, not in the grand scheme of things. And what you actually have to do is to fight for those who are currently being marginalised and oppressed, have to fight for a different way of doing things. How would you, in your scheme, how does that fit in?
Well, I don't think it's an either-or situation. I think it's more likely that fight would be won or eased if, in fact, you can establish that there is a rationale, a good rationale, which ultimately comes down to interest convergence. You're going to create a better society. I think you have to argue in that way. That we have obligations to our fellow human beings through human rights legislation, human rights principles, and that it is necessary it is helpful for people to realise that they have these obligations, and to meet them is in their interest, as it were. It is in the interests of people to avoid criminality, to avoid high incidence of people in institutions for psychiatric disorders, and that one of the ways of ameliorating that, reducing that, is through improving the performance and the self-concept of people. So I think I come back to having some faith in human beings. Otherwise, what is the alternative? That human beings will only do things if they're in a fight situation and they're going to see that they're going to lose this game? Or do we have to think of it in different ways of human beings ultimately are good? It comes down to our notion of a human being. Are we there as animals fighting for a little bit of territory? Are we there simply to get power? Or are we prepared to work to function as human beings, as social animals? And I think ultimately, I ask that question myself. Why are we permitting these discrepancies, which are very serious, to be maintained? Why? What is it about our human nature? I haven't come up to the answer to that, but I've just given part of it now. And I would be building on trust, goodwill, social conscience, as well as thinking that sometimes people need to be coerced. you may need some coercion. Our laws do have coercive elements to them, but at the same time, those laws are based on principles of a good society, working together cooperatively.
Thank you very much. Please can we thank David again.
Thank you.